The lecture hall was packed as usual. Professor Wilson stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the students in front of him. A well-respected figure in the university, he carried himself with an air of authority. His reputation for brilliance in mathematics preceded him, and students often whispered about how intimidating it was to be in his class. Most were either too afraid to challenge him or too in awe of his intellect to question anything he said. David sat near the back, like he always did. He wasn't someone who liked to draw attention to himself. He wasn't a loud student, and he didn't speak unless he had something important to say. But when he did speak, it was always measured, thoughtful, and precise. David was different from the others in the class. He wasn't like the usual bright students who were constantly in the spotlight. He wasn't the type to boast about his grades or brag about solving difficult problems. In fact, David preferred to keep to himself. But deep down, he knew that his mind worked in ways that few could understand. And that included Professor Wilson. The professor had given the class a problem, nothing too complicated, or so he thought. He was convinced it was a typical exercise to see how well students grasped the concepts they'd been studying. It was the kind of thing every student could solve if they were paying attention. The math was simple. Too simple, in fact. That was the point. David had been listening intently. His focus was sharp, but there was something about the problem that didn't sit right with him. He looked at the equation on the board and his mind immediately started working, running through different possibilities, different methods of solving it. He felt a flicker of something deep inside him, a familiar surge of clarity, like the pieces of a puzzle falling into place. His hand shot up without a second thought. Professor Wilson paused, looking over at him with a raised eyebrow. "Yes, David?" The room fell silent. Every student in the class knew who David was. He was the quiet one, the student who kept his head down, never bothered anyone, and only spoke when absolutely necessary. He wasn't exactly someone who stuck out, but he was also the one people talked about. They whispered about his strange ability to solve problems that no one else could. David's voice broke the silence. "I think the problem is wrong, Professor." A few students exchanged glances, confused. The professor's lips curled into a smirk, as if to say, "Are you sure about that, David?" Professor Wilson had been teaching for years. His confidence in his own intelligence was unshakable, and he didn't take kindly to being challenged by anyone, especially a student like David. "Oh? And what makes you think that?" the professor asked, his tone laced with amusement. David's eyes remained steady. He wasn't nervous, he never was. In fact, he wasn't even trying to prove anything. He was simply stating the truth as he saw it. His mind was already racing, finding the discrepancies, uncovering the flaws in the equation. "I'm sure," David said quietly, almost too quietly. But there was an undeniable firmness in his voice that made the professor pause. Without waiting for any further approval, David stood up and made his way to the front of the room. The class watched in stunned silence as he walked toward the blackboard. Professor Wilson had never been challenged like this before, not by a student like David. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was confident that the young man wouldn't be able to prove his point. David stood before the blackboard, feeling the eyes of his classmates on him. But in this moment, he didn't care. All that mattered was the math. He grabbed a piece of chalk and, without hesitation, started writing. The professor crossed his arms, leaning against the desk at the front of the room. He studied David closely, waiting for him to fail. The other students shifted in their seats, wondering what would happen next. They were used to the professor being the one to hold the spotlight, not some quiet student who barely spoke a word. David's chalk moved quickly, but his hand was steady. It was as if his mind was operating in overdrive, working faster than his body could keep up. With every equation, every number he wrote, it became clear that David wasn't just solving the problem. He was doing something far more extraordinary. The professor's smirk began to fade. At first, he thought David was simply demonstrating some basic calculations, but soon, it became evident that David was taking the problem in an entirely different direction. The way David was approaching the equation wasn't just about getting the right answer, it was about finding a deeper understanding of the problem. David's approach was unconventional. It was unlike anything the professor had seen before. He was showing a method of solving the problem that was not only elegant but also had the potential to unlock new areas of mathematics. The answer to the problem wasn't just correct, it was revolutionary. The class was speechless. Some students leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. Others simply stared, wide-eyed. Professor Wilson, the expert in his field, stood frozen, as if the world around him had stopped moving. David finished his calculations and stepped back, waiting for the professor to respond. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. Professor Wilson's lips parted, but no words came out. His face had gone pale, his expression unreadable. He had expected David to make a mistake, to falter under pressure, but instead, he had just witnessed something extraordinary. David had not only solved the problem, he had exposed an entirely new way of thinking about it. Finally, Professor Wilson spoke, though his voice was much softer than usual. I see. David didn't acknowledge the professor's words. He simply returned to his seat, his mind already moving on to the next thought. He had never expected to prove himself to anyone. He wasn't doing this for recognition. But now, as he sat back down and looked at the stunned faces around him, he realized something: the world had just changed, and he was no longer invisible. The professor tried to regain his composure, but it was clear that his usual arrogance had been shaken. The rest of the class, too, was in a state of shock. They had never seen David like this before. They had never seen anyone like him. But this moment was just the beginning. What none of them knew was that David had just unleashed something far bigger than a mathematical breakthrough. The battle between him and the professors was only beginning. The real test was yet to come, and it wouldn't just be about math anymore. It would be about something far more dangerous: the fight for recognition, for respect, and for the truth. David's journey had just begun, and no one, least of all the professors who had tried to undermine him, had any idea of the storm he was about to bring. The days following the incident in Professor Wilson's class were a blur for David. For the first time, people were noticing him. Not just noticing, but talking about him. Whispers filled the hallways of the university. In every class he attended, he could feel the weight of their stares, the curiosity in their eyes, and the underlying sense of awe that came from his unexpected display of genius. But there was something else, too. Something that gnawed at him. Something that wasn't right. David was used to being overlooked, ignored. He had spent most of his time in the shadows, preferring it that way. But now, the spotlight was on him, and it was starting to feel uncomfortable. It wasn't just the students who were talking about him. No, the real problem lay with the professors. His peers had always dismissed him as the quiet, reserved student. But now, the professors, the very people who held the power to shape his future, suddenly viewed him through a different lens. He could feel the tension whenever he walked into a classroom. Professor Wilson, especially, seemed to view him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. David had never asked for attention, and certainly never asked to be the center of a power struggle between him and the faculty. But that was exactly what was beginning to happen. It wasn't long before David's next class with Professor Wilson came around. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words. Students were already whispering to each other as David entered. The usual whispers had turned into more than just gossip, they had morphed into something more dangerous: suspicion. The professor walked in, scanning the room, his eyes lingering on David for just a second too long. "Today, we're going to move on to something a bit more advanced," Professor Wilson said, his voice colder than usual. "I'll be handing out a set of problems. The goal is to see how well you can apply the methods we've discussed in the last few weeks." The students nodded and shifted in their seats as he passed out the problem sheets. David's fingers curled around the paper, but he didn't look at it right away. His mind was racing. Something was off. He could feel the tension in the air, like a storm was building and nobody was willing to acknowledge it. As Professor Wilson reached his desk at the front of the room, David finally opened the sheet. The problem was a complicated one, certainly more advanced than the last exercise, but David didn't hesitate. He quickly scanned the instructions, his mind already working through the steps in a way that seemed almost effortless. He raised his hand without a second thought. Professor Wilson didn't look at him right away. Instead, he continued to lecture, almost as if he were deliberately ignoring him. The other students glanced at each other, unsure of what was happening. David's hand stayed raised. After a moment, the professor finally acknowledged him, his expression tight, almost annoyed. "Yes, David," he asked, his tone clipped. "I think there's an issue with the problem," David said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something sharper than usual. "The equation seems incomplete. There's an essential variable missing that would affect the final solution." A murmur ran through the class. Some students looked at each other, unsure if David was just overthinking things or if he was, once again, pointing out something they had missed. Professor Wilson's jaw tightened. "That's a bold statement, David. You're saying the problem is flawed?" David nodded. "Yes, sir. I believe it is." The room grew still, but not in the way it had been during the first incident. This time, there was an edge to the atmosphere. The students, many of whom had been skeptical of David's abilities to begin with, were now beginning to question him. Some of them didn't want to admit it, but they were starting to see that David might actually be right. Professor Wilson's eyes narrowed as he moved towards the board. "Well, if you're so confident in your assessment, why don't you show us how it's done?" David stood up and walked to the board. The moment he picked up the chalk, he could feel the weight of every eye on him. He took a deep breath and began to work through the problem, carefully laying out each step, revealing the flaw in the professor's problem setup. As his chalk moved across the board, David noticed something he hadn't before. The faces in the room weren't just watching him, they were scrutinizing him. The professor, who had once exuded a sense of control and authority, now looked increasingly unsettled. He stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, silent. When David finished, he stepped back and waited. The answer wasn't just correct, it was a revelation. It exposed a fundamental misunderstanding of the math in the problem itself, and in a way that showed the professor had made a significant error. The silence in the room was deafening. But this time, it wasn't out of admiration or awe. It was a mixture of disbelief, discomfort, and resentment. David looked at the professor, his expression calm but determined. "The problem can't be solved unless that variable is accounted for. You can't move forward without it." Professor Wilson cleared his throat, his face turning slightly red. "I see," he muttered. "I'll take another look at it." David returned to his seat, but he could feel the eyes of every student on him. Some were looking at him with admiration, but many were starting to view him as a threat. The delicate balance of power had shifted. And it wasn't just Professor Wilson who had noticed. Others in the faculty were starting to watch him closely, too. Later that day, David was walking across campus when he saw two professors standing near the entrance to the library. They were talking in low tones, their eyes following David as he passed. It wasn't the first time he had felt like someone was watching him, but this time, it was different. The professors weren't just watching, they were whispering about him, plotting something he didn't understand. It wasn't long before David started hearing rumors from his classmates. Some said that Professor Wilson had been furious after the incident. Others claimed he had started spreading rumors about David's unusual methods and unconventional approach to solving problems. The whispers were turning into accusations, and David's name was becoming synonymous with trouble. The worst part was that the more David tried to prove himself, the more people seemed to doubt him. The professors were starting to question his credibility, and the students, too, were beginning to wonder if David had simply gotten lucky. No one was willing to admit that he had done something no one else could. That night, as David sat alone in his dorm room, the weight of the situation finally hit him. He wasn't just facing a challenge in math, he was facing something much bigger. The professors who had once viewed him with indifference were now actively trying to discredit him. They didn't understand him, and they certainly didn't want to acknowledge the fact that a student like him, someone who didn't fit their mold, had outsmarted them. David wasn't just fighting for recognition. He was fighting for something far more important, his place in a world that had long ignored him. The next day, he walked into Professor Wilson's class again. This time, he didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. As soon as the professor walked in, David knew there would be no more easy victories. The game had changed, and the fight for recognition had only just begun. David knew that something had changed. The atmosphere on campus felt thicker, like the air had been charged with static, and he could almost feel the unease hanging over him wherever he went. The professors had begun to look at him differently, and though no one had come right out and said anything, David could tell something was brewing just beneath the surface. His classmates, too, had started to distance themselves. He was no longer just the quiet student in the back. He was the student who had disrupted the status quo, and that made him dangerous in their eyes. It had been a week since his last confrontation with Professor Wilson, and things had escalated in ways David didn't fully understand yet. Rumors about his so-called unorthodox methods had spread like wildfire. Some students were impressed, others not so much. It didn't matter, though, David had learned to block out the noise. But what really bothered him was the feeling that he was being watched, that there was something more going on than just a few disgruntled professors. He wasn't wrong. David arrived at his next lecture, trying to push the tension from his mind, but it clung to him like a shadow. As he entered the room, he noticed Professor Wilson wasn't there yet, and the usual group of students who had been whispering about him were quiet now. They watched him as if he were a ticking time bomb, and they weren't sure when it would explode. David took his usual seat, glancing at the clock. Professor Wilson was never late. The door opened suddenly, and in walked a man David hadn't seen before, tall, with graying hair and a stern expression. He wore a dark suit and had an air of authority about him. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He stood at the front of the class for a moment, scanning the students with a gaze that seemed to pierce through them. "Good morning," the man said, his voice deep and commanding. "I'm Professor Green. I'll be filling in for Professor Wilson today. He's indisposed." There was an awkward pause. David didn't know what to make of it. Professor Wilson had never been absent without prior notice. But here was this stranger, standing in his place. "Now," Professor Green continued, "we'll be diving into a new set of problems today. But before that, I'd like to discuss some of the concepts we've covered so far. Specifically, I'd like to focus on the methods of problem solving we've used. The ones that have been, let's say, tested." David felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the professor's tone that made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the words, but the way he said them, like he knew something that David didn't. He looked at the other students. They were all sitting unnervingly still, as if they too could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Professor Green's gaze landed on David, and the chill intensified. "Mr. David, would you care to explain your approach to the last problem we solved?" he asked, his voice calm but with a sharp edge. David didn't like where this was going. He hesitated before standing up. He hadn't even touched the problem yet. His mind was still processing everything from the previous encounters. And now, here was this new professor, demanding answers like he was setting a trap. David walked to the board, chalk in hand, and began writing. The problem was similar to the one he had solved in Professor Wilson's class, but it wasn't the same. There was a subtle difference, a missing component that made the entire equation feel incomplete, just like the one before. He paused, looking at the class. Everyone was staring at him, waiting for him to finish. He could feel the pressure mounting, and he had to fight the instinct to run. This wasn't just about math anymore. This was about survival. As he wrote, he sensed that Professor Green was watching him closely. It wasn't the usual type of scrutiny, a professor studying a student's solution. No, it felt more like an interrogation. David could almost feel the weight of the professor's eyes on his back, drilling into him. David finished the solution and stepped back from the board. Professor Green didn't move for a moment, but then he cleared his throat. "Interesting," he said. "But I believe you've missed a key element here. A variable that should be included, according to standard methods." David frowned. He had checked the math thoroughly. He had gone over it twice. There was no way he'd missed anything. "Perhaps you'd like to explain what you see?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He wasn't going to let this man push him around. Professor Green smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I see a gap, Mr. David. A gap in your understanding of the problem. A gap that I think you'll find difficult to bridge on your own." David's blood ran cold. The tension in the room was palpable. Every student in the class seemed to hold their breath, as if they were waiting for a bomb to go off. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. Something was about to snap. Professor Green's smile widened. "I'm afraid I'll have to report this to the department. You've demonstrated an alarming lack of precision in your work. We can't let this slide." David's heart raced. This wasn't about math anymore. This was about something else. Professor Green's words were like a signal, a declaration that he was about to be pushed out, dismissed, silenced. As he walked back to his seat, David felt the weight of those words pressing down on him. Alarming lack of precision. The rest of the lecture passed in a blur. David's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. Why had this new professor singled him out like that? What was the real agenda here? It wasn't about the math. It couldn't be. Later that day, David went to the library to try and clear his mind. He sat at a quiet corner table, flicking through his textbooks, trying to focus on the problems in front of him. But the more he thought about it, the more something didn't add up. Professor Green's behavior seemed off, but David couldn't pinpoint exactly why. It wasn't just the criticism, it was the way he'd come into the classroom with a sense of purpose, like he had an agenda. He hadn't just been filling in for a sick colleague. He had been testing David. His eyes had been too focused, too intense. It wasn't about math at all. David felt like he was being pushed into a corner, but by who, exactly? Why was someone so determined to take him down? What did they see in him that made him so dangerous? As he closed his textbook, a voice broke through his thoughts. "David." He turned to see his classmate, Rachel, standing in front of him. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before sitting down across from him. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice low. David frowned. "What's going on?" "I heard them talking," Rachel said. "The professors. They're watching you. They know you're different. And they don't like it." David's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "They've been talking about your work. Saying it's unorthodox," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's more than that. They think you're a threat. They don't want anyone to know what you can really do." David's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to fall into place. This wasn't just about him challenging their authority in class. This was something deeper. They were afraid of what he represented. They were afraid of the truth he could expose. He leaned forward, urgency in his voice. "What else did they say?" Rachel hesitated, then whispered, "They think you're hiding something. Something big. They're not just trying to discredit you, David. They want to control you. Keep you in line. David sat back, his mind racing. He had been right all along. There was something much bigger going on here. And if he was going to survive this, he would have to outsmart them. He couldn't trust anyone, not the professors, not even his classmates. He was on his own. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to back down. David woke up the next morning with a heavy weight on his chest. The silence in his room felt suffocating. His thoughts were a whirlwind, Professor Green's words, Rachel's warnings, and the overwhelming feeling that he was being hunted. But he couldn't afford to stay in that haze of fear and confusion. He had to act, and he had to act fast. The realization that the professors weren't just concerned with his academic performance, that they were actively plotting against him, changed everything. He wasn't just fighting for a grade anymore. He was fighting for his future. And possibly, for his freedom. As he walked through the campus, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, there were too many moments when he caught someone staring at him, students, faculty members, even. He's security guard on campus who usually passed by without so much as a glance. David felt their eyes follow him, calculating, waiting for him to slip up. By the time he arrived at the math building, his mind was running in overdrive. There was no way he could continue with his classes like this. He couldn't risk more encounters with Professor Green, or any of the others who seemed to be in on whatever twisted game was being played. The campus wasn't safe anymore, and his usual strategy of staying quiet and blending in was no longer an option. He needed information. He needed to understand what was really going on, and why they were so determined to shut him down. David made his way to the library, a quiet place that had become his sanctuary in recent days. It was where he could think, gather his thoughts, and work on his problems without the constant pressure of being watched. But even now, as he sat at his usual table near the back, he felt the presence of others. It was almost as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He had no idea who was watching, but the sensation of being observed was stronger than ever. His laptop sat open in front of him, and for the first time in days, David didn't feel like tackling any math problems. Instead, he typed a single question into the search engine: Professor Green, who is he? The search results flooded the screen. There were a few academic articles mentioning his name, mostly regarding his recent guest lectures at other prestigious institutions. There were no personal details, nothing to suggest he had any significant history at the university beyond his recent appointment. But then something caught David's eye, a news article buried in the results, with a headline that made his blood run cold. Local university professor under investigation for alleged misconduct, details unclear. David clicked on the link without hesitation. The article was brief, but the implications were huge. It was from a local news outlet that covered regional affairs and higher education scandals. The article mentioned that a professor, unnamed in the article, had been under investigation for several months, but the details of the investigation were kept under wraps by the university. It hinted at serious allegations, but no one had spoken openly about the professor's identity. The more David read, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Was Professor Green involved in this? Was he the one under investigation? And why was he now taking such a personal interest in David? David had no solid answers, but he knew one thing: he couldn't trust anyone, not even the faculty. And if there was a scandal brewing, he had to dig deeper to find out who was behind it and how it connected to his situation. But there was still one crucial thing missing from the puzzle. What was it that David had done, or rather, what did they think he had done, to make them go to such extreme lengths? To shut him down? He hadn't broken any rules, had he? The next class session would be a turning point. David knew that he couldn't sit back anymore. It was time to confront the professors, to find out once and for all what they were hiding. David entered the classroom with a new sense of resolve. It was a different feeling compared to the fear and uncertainty he had felt just days ago. Today, he was determined. The moment Professor Green walked into the room, David knew things would change. Professor Green seemed as composed as always, but today there was something more in his eyes, a calculated gleam that David hadn't noticed before. He couldn't shake the feeling that Green knew more about him than he let on. He had to be involved in whatever secret operation was unfolding, and David was going to get to the bottom of it. As David took his seat, he noticed that the class seemed unusually quiet. The students who had once been talking amongst themselves were now silent, as though they were all waiting for something to happen. When the class began, David couldn't focus on the material. His mind kept drifting back to the article he had found in the library. Was Professor Green part of some larger conspiracy? And if so, why? What was he hiding? When it was time for the professor to ask questions, David's heart raced. He knew it was now or never. "Professor Green," David said, his voice steady but laced with urgency, "I have a question about your recent research. I came across an article that mentioned a professor under investigation. Are you involved in that?" The classroom went deathly silent. Professor Green's eyes narrowed. He didn't answer immediately, but instead, his gaze flicked to the rest of the class. There was an uncomfortable pause. It was as if the room had become a pressure cooker, and David had just lit the fuse. "I don't think that's an appropriate question for a classroom discussion," Green said, his voice cold. "Let's stick to the curriculum, shall we?" David didn't back down. He knew now that he was playing a dangerous game, but he couldn't afford to show fear. "Not now. Professor," David continued, his voice rising slightly, "I have a right to know. If you're involved in something like that, I need to understand why it matters to me. Why it's affecting my grades. Why you've made me your target." The professor's face twitched slightly, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "David, I think you've misunderstood the situation. I'm here to teach you, not to engage in personal matters." "But you're not teaching me," David shot back. "You're testing me. Pushing me to the edge." "Why?" Professor Green's smile faded, replaced by a tense expression. For a split second, David saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark, something dangerous. It was gone in a flash, but David caught it. He wasn't imagining things. "I suggest you drop this, David," Green said. His voice low and menacing. "You don't want to know what you're getting into." David's heart pounded. He had just uncovered the first real crack in Green's facade, and he could feel the walls closing in. He was in too deep now. There was no turning back. The class ended in an awkward silence, with everyone else too afraid to speak up. As David gathered his things, he felt someone's hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Rachel again. "David, you need to be careful," she whispered. "You're getting too close to the truth. They won't stop until you're gone." David nodded, but he knew it was already too late. The truth was out there, and no matter what it took, he was going to find it. The following day, David felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Confronting Professor Green had not gone as he had hoped, but it had opened a door he knew he couldn't close now, no matter how much he wanted to. He had seen the fear in Green's eyes, a brief flicker of something real, something that hinted at a deeper danger. And Rachel's warning echoed in his mind, "They won't stop until you're gone." David spent the next few hours in the campus library, searching through more articles, records, and even the university's internal bulletin boards. But there was nothing concrete. No clear evidence tying Professor Green to any scandal. The more he searched, the more it felt like the walls of the university were closing in on him, blocking his every attempt to find the truth. But he couldn't give up now. He was already too deep, and if he didn't push forward, everything he had fought for would be lost. The library, once a place of solace, now felt like a cage. Every glance, every footstep echoing in the quiet corners, made him feel like he was being watched. His stomach churned as the truth became more elusive with each passing moment. He had to confront this head-on. No more running. That evening, David met Rachel again in the dimly lit corner of the campus cafe. She had texted him earlier, urging him to meet, and he knew she had information, something important. As he approached their usual table, Rachel's face was shadowed with concern, but also determination. It was clear she wasn't going to hold back this time. "David, you need to know something," Rachel said, leaning in so only he could hear. "There's more to this than you realize. Green isn't just targeting you. This is bigger than a few professors." David's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's really going on?" Rachel glanced around, as if she expected someone to eavesdrop. "There's a group, a hidden network within the university. They've been manipulating things behind the scenes for years, creating false records, altering grades, even blackmailing students. Green's just one of them." David stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious? A group like that could exist on a campus this big?" Rachel nodded gravely. "It's not just the professors. There are staff members, researchers, people who've been involved in shady dealings for years. And they don't take kindly to anyone who threatens their operation. You're not just dealing with Green anymore. You've made enemies. Powerful ones." David's mind raced. "So, you're saying I'm in danger?" Rachel hesitated, her eyes darkening. "Yes. But there's more you need to understand. They've been watching you, tracking your every move. They knew about you before you even set foot on campus." David recoiled. "What do you mean, they knew about me?" Rachel looked at him directly. "You're not just some random student, David. You're the key to their plans. You're a threat to everything they've built." David's thoughts spun. He couldn't grasp what she was saying. How could he be a threat to something so deep and dangerous? What could he possibly have done to draw their attention? "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's gaze softened, but the weight of her words hit him harder than anything else. "Because of your math skills, David. You don't realize it, but your talents, your ability to solve complex equations faster than anyone, they've been monitoring you for years. You're the key to cracking something they've been working on for a long time. And they've been waiting for you to make a move." David felt a chill run through him. His mind flickered back to his early days at the university, the strange moments when he had felt that odd sense of déjà vu, like he was being watched. But he had brushed it off, thinking it was just nerves. "Are you saying that my math skills are some kind of weapon?" he asked, trying to wrap his mind around the words Rachel had just dropped on him. "Exactly," Rachel replied. "They've been grooming you. They've been waiting for the right moment to pull you into their schemes. You're not just a student. You're part of something much bigger." David sat back, his heart pounding in his chest. "So, what do I do now? How do I stop them?" Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is the next step. There's a file in there, evidence of their operations. But be careful. Once you open that, there's no going back." David stared at the envelope, unsure whether he was ready to face the truth, or if he would even survive what was coming next. But he knew he had no choice. He had already taken the first step into this dark web, and there was no turning back now. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty and fear. David couldn't focus on his classes, couldn't stop thinking about the file Rachel had given him. He had to open it. He knew it held the key to everything. But he had learned long ago that knowledge came with a price. That night, in the solitude of his dorm room, David hesitated. He held the envelope in his hands, staring at it as if it were a ticking time bomb. With a deep breath, he tore it open. Inside were several printed documents, files, letters, and images. As David sifted through the pages, his eyes widened in shock. The first document was a list of names, faculty members, staff, even some students, all part of the network that had been operating behind the scenes. The second document was a detailed map of the university, with certain buildings marked in red. David recognized them immediately: the math department, the administration building, and even the campus library. But what chilled him to the core was the final document, an encrypted list of equations and formulas that made no sense to him at first glance. The list seemed to be a blueprint, a set of algorithms, complex, almost beyond comprehension. It didn't take a math genius to know that whatever these equations represented, they were more than just numbers. They were part of a larger scheme, a puzzle that David now had to solve if he wanted to get to the truth. He had uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, but it was only a small fraction of what he needed to uncover. David felt his heart race as the weight of the situation settled in. The professors, the university, even Rachel, everything had been leading to this moment. And now, with this file in his hands, David was more determined than ever. He would unravel the mystery, no matter what it took. The web of lies and manipulation was finally starting to unravel, and he was going to expose it all. The following days brought more danger and more uncertainty. Every step David took toward the truth seemed to be met with resistance. Someone was watching him. He could feel it in his bones. But he was no longer afraid. He had come too far to stop now. David's world had become a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and discovery. With every step he took toward uncovering the truth, the walls around him seemed to close in tighter. The envelope Rachel had given him had been both a blessing and a curse. It revealed more than he could have ever imagined: documents, names, and numbers that tied Professor Green, along with several other faculty members, to a secret network operating deep within the university. But the knowledge came at a high cost. David knew that no one could be trusted now, not even Rachel, who seemed to be guiding him along this perilous path. He sat at his desk in his dorm room, the last remaining light from the street lamp outside casting shadows on the walls. The map of the university, now spread out on the floor in front of him, marked certain locations in crimson red, buildings he had already suspected, but now there was something more. These weren't just places of academic importance, they were crucial to whatever plan Green and his associates were hiding. David couldn't make sense of everything. The encrypted formulas in the documents were still a mystery to him, though they seemed connected to the conspiracy in some way. The list of names had grown longer, and David was beginning to realize just how deep this went. What started as a personal vendetta from one professor had evolved into something much darker, a covert operation with ties to people in power, using the university as a cover. And now, the key was David himself. He was caught in the middle of a game where the rules were hidden, and the stakes were far greater than he had ever imagined. He needed answers. But there was no one he could turn to. He couldn't trust Rachel fully anymore. Even his best friend Lucas had started acting strangely. Every conversation felt like it was veiled in secrecy. Everyone seemed to have their own agenda, their own connection to the dark web of deception surrounding him. David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that time was running out. It was late when he received the call. The phone buzzed on his desk, breaking the silence of the room. He looked at the screen: blocked number. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He knew it wasn't a coincidence. Whoever it was, they knew everything. He answered the phone, his voice trembling slightly. "Hello?" "David," a familiar voice replied, cold, calculating, and unmistakably Professor Green's. "I hope you're enjoying the games we've been playing. But I think it's time you understand the real reason you're here." David's heart raced. He couldn't respond immediately, unsure whether this was a trap or some twisted mind game. He had hoped to confront Green face to face, but now, on the phone, he could feel the weight of the professor's influence. "What do you want from me?" David finally managed to say, his voice steady but filled with underlying fear. "You're more valuable than you realize," Green said, his voice oozing with control. "I've been watching you for a long time. Your abilities, your genius, they're exactly what we need. You see, David, this university isn't just about education. It's about power. And we've been collecting the best minds for a reason. David's pulse quickened. Green's words were cryptic, but he could feel the underlying menace in them. He wasn't just a student anymore, he was part of something far bigger. You're not going to get away with this, David said, his words coming out more firmly than he had intended. I know what you're doing. I know about the network, the manipulation. It's all in the documents I found. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Green's voice returned, calm but unmistakably dangerous. You have no idea what you're dealing with. If you think you can stop us, you're wrong. You're already part of the plan, David. You've always been. David's mind reeled. What was Green talking about? The plan? He had to push for more information. What plan? Why me? What do you need from me? Green chuckled softly. You've already begun to unravel it. The equations, the algorithms, they are a map. They lead to something far more important than you could ever imagine. And you're the key to unlocking it. David's heart dropped. It felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. He wasn't just an unwilling participant in this conspiracy. He was the linchpin, the one who could break open the entire operation. But why? What was the end goal? And why had it all started with him? Where are you? David asked, his voice urgent. I need to see you. I need answers. Green's laugh sent a chill down David's spine. Come to the math building at midnight. The truth will be waiting for you. The call ended abruptly, leaving David staring at his phone, uncertain of what he had just heard. Midnight. He couldn't back out now. He had no choice. This was his chance to finally confront Green and get the answers he had been seeking. When David arrived at the math building, the silence in the air was deafening. The campus was eerily quiet, almost as if it too were holding its breath. He had never been here this late at night, and the dark corridors felt like they were closing in on him with every step. His heart pounded in his chest, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise still hallways. As he made his way toward the professor's office, his thoughts raced. Green had said the truth would be waiting for him. But what truth? What could he possibly learn that would explain everything? The equations, the names, the secret network, the conspiracy had only deepened as the days went by. When he reached Green's office, the door was slightly ajar. David pushed it open, his stomach turning with every inch it creaked. Inside, the room was dark, save for a single desk lamp casting long shadows over the papers scattered on the desk. David took a cautious step forward, scanning the room for any sign of the professor. And then he saw it. The desk was covered in more documents, some of the same equations he had seen in the files Rachel gave him. But there was something different about this batch. The equations were no longer just numbers and symbols, they were interconnected, creating a larger picture. It was a code. A code that, if solved, would unlock something powerful, something dangerous. David reached for one of the papers, but before he could examine it further, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his heart racing as Professor Green stepped into the room. The professor's eyes were gleaming with something dark, something triumphant. You've been chasing ghosts, David, Green said, his voice smooth but filled with malice. But you've finally found the truth. David's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment of reckoning. Why me? David demanded. Why all of this? What are you trying to do? Green took a step closer, his smile cold and calculated. We needed someone with your brilliance, David. Someone who could solve these equations. They're more than just math. They're a blueprint for the future. And you, David, you're the key to unlocking it. David's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just about power, it was about control. They had been using the university, using David, to create something that could change the world. But at what cost? "You're wrong," David said, his voice shaky but filled with defiance. "I won't help you. I'll expose everything." Green's expression darkened. "You're too late for that, David. You've already played your part. And now, there's no going back." David's heart pounded as Green reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a small, unmarked envelope. "Take this," Green said, pushing it toward David. "It's the last piece of the puzzle. Solve it, and you'll understand everything." David stared at the envelope, torn between taking it and running. He knew he had no choice. He had to solve this final equation if he was going to stop whatever Green had planned. With trembling hands, David opened the envelope, revealing a series of symbols. The final equation.